40 preserved meat for 2 years without a fridge. The $7 Amish method the FDA pretends doesn't exist. Rain hammers the roof while the lights flicker. Again, you know that feeling. The freezer hum goes silent. The house gets strangely quiet. And for a moment, your mind starts counting dollars. A quarter of a beef, packages of pork, venison from last season, months of food sitting behind one electrical cord. Years ago, I stood in a pantry during a storm like that. Not a modern pantry filled with boxes and plastic. A plain room, wooden shelves, glass jars. A few crocks tucked against a cool wall. What caught my eye wasn't the room. It was the meat. Not frozen, not plugged in, not sitting on ice. And according to the family that stored it there, some of it had been packed away far longer than most people would believe. The stranger part was this: the method itself wasn't complicated. It cost less than $7. And once I learned why that pantry stayed calm when the power went out, I started seeing modern food storage in a very different way. Before we go further, I'd like to hear something from you. Think back to your parents, grandparents, or an older neighbor. Was there a food-saving habit they used that people around you no longer practice? Maybe it was canning, maybe smoking meat, maybe a root cellar behind the house. Those old lessons disappear one family at a time. If keeping practical knowledge alive matters to you, pull up a chair and stay a while. There are fewer people talking about these things every year. Most folks today trust food because they trust electricity. That isn't criticism. It's simply the world we've grown used to. A freezer sits in the garage. Another one hums in the basement. Sometimes a third stands in a back room filled with sale meat and bulk purchases. The arrangement works well until something interrupts it. A storm, a blown transformer, an aging appliance that quits during the night. Suddenly, the thing protecting hundreds or even thousands of dollars worth of food is revealed for what it always was: a machine, useful, convenient, and far less permanent than many people assume. I remember an older fellow named Eli who lived a few miles outside town. He wasn't Amish, though he shared many of the same habits. His barn smelled faintly of sawdust and old leather. Every tool seemed to have a place. Nothing fancy. Nothing wasted. During one summer storm, power lines dropped across several roads. People worried about refrigerators and freezers. Eli barely mentioned it. He walked out to his porch, watched the rain, and carried on with his evening. That calm stayed with me. Not because he knew something magical, because he had built his household around options rather than dependence. At the time, I assumed he must have owned a large generator. Many people did. It seemed like the obvious answer. But when I asked about it later, he shook his head. He believed machines were useful. He simply didn't believe they should be the only plan. That answer opened a door. The more I spoke with older farmers and longtime homesteaders, the more I noticed a pattern. They respected modern conveniences. They just remembered life before them. And because they remembered, they carried skills that most families quietly stopped passing down after refrigerators became common in nearly every home. That is where the story becomes interesting. Long before a plug existed in every kitchen wall, families still had livestock. They still butchered hogs. They still raised chickens. They still hunted deer. Meat was valuable. Sometimes it represented months of labor. Losing it was not an inconvenience. It could mean genuine hardship. So people developed ways to preserve what they had. Some salted heavily, some smoked for days, others dried meat carefully. And scattered among those methods was another practice that receives far less attention today, despite surviving in traditional communities and old household records. The strange thing is that many modern people have seen part of the method without realizing it. They have watched fat harden in a pan after cooking. They have scraped cooled grease into a container. They have noticed how it forms a barrier once it solidifies. Most never think beyond that moment. Earlier generations often did. They observed the world differently because observation was part of survival. They paid attention to what spoiled quickly and what remained protected. Small details mattered. A lid mattered. A cellar mattered. A layer of fat mattered. Those observations became practical knowledge handed from one kitchen to another. Now, none of this means old methods were perfect. That is important to say plainly. Many traditional preservation practices required care, cleanliness, and experience. They were not shortcuts. They demanded attention. The people who relied on them understood that mistakes carried consequences. Sometimes modern discussions become trapped between two extremes. One side assumes old methods were foolish. The other assumes old methods were flawless. Neither view tells the whole truth. the reality is often quieter. Certain techniques survived because they solved real problems, but the people who used them also respected the limits of those techniques. What fascinates me most is not the method itself. It is what happened after refrigerators became widespread. Household skills began disappearing at remarkable speed, not because they stopped working entirely, not because every older practice became obsolete overnight. Convenience changed the calculation. Why spend time learning preservation when a freezer can do the job? Why teach children techniques they may never need? The shift made sense. Yet every convenience comes with a trade. Sometimes the trade is invisible until years later, when knowledge once considered ordinary becomes rare enough to seem mysterious. And that brings us back to the pantry that caught my attention during that storm years ago. The shelves were plain, the jars were plain. Nothing about the room looked extraordinary. Yet hidden inside that simplicity was an idea older than modern appliances and stubborn enough to survive long after many people forgot it. The question was not whether the meat sat there. I had seen that with my own eyes. The real question was what created the protective barrier that made such storage possible in the first place. And the answer begins with something most kitchens throw away without a second thought. The answer in many cases was fat. Not the thin layer left on a dinner plate, not the grease splattered across a stovetop. Properly rendered fat, clean, stable, carefully prepared. Many old households treated it as a resource, not a waste product. Tradition holds that various communities across Europe and North America used fat-based preservation methods in different forms for generations. The idea was surprisingly simple. Cooked meat could be packed into a container and covered beneath a layer of rendered fat. Once cooled, that fat hardened into a seal that helped reduce exposure to air. Nothing mystical, no secret ingredient from a hidden catalog. Just careful use of materials already present during butchering season. The first time someone explained it to me, I almost laughed. Not because it sounded impossible, because it sounded too ordinary. We are trained to expect complicated answers. Modern life teaches us that every problem requires a machine, a subscription, or a specialized product. Yet many older solutions began with observation. A farmer notices one thing spoils quickly while another lasts longer. A mother notices certain foods stay fresh beneath a protective layer. A butcher notices that careful handling changes outcomes. Over time, those observations become habits, then traditions, then skills. Eventually, people stop asking why they work because the knowledge becomes woven into everyday life. That simplicity creates a different question. If generations trusted methods like this, why did they fade from view? The answer has less to do with effectiveness and more to do with convenience. Imagine you are living in the 1940s or 1950s. Refrigeration begins entering more homes. Suddenly, food storage becomes easier. No rendering, no packing, no careful preparation. Just place food inside a cold box and shut the door. Most families welcome that change. Who wouldn't? The freezer solved real problems. But convenience has a habit of pushing older skills into the background. Once enough people stop practicing something, the knowledge begins slipping away faster than anyone expects. That does not mean the knowledge vanished completely. In rural communities, among homesteaders, and within families that continued processing their own food, pieces of it survived. You still find people who remember grandparents storing food differently. You still hear stories about pantry shelves that remained useful through long winters. Sometimes the details vary from one region to another. Sometimes the techniques differ, but the underlying lesson remains remarkably consistent. Earlier generations rarely trusted a single solution. They layered methods, they built backup plans. They understood that resilience often comes from having several workable options instead of one perfect answer. Now here is the part many people overlook. The preservation method itself was only half the story. Environment mattered just as much. A cool pantry mattered. A cellar mattered. Clean containers mattered. The condition of the meat mattered. That is why honest conversations about traditional preservation should avoid magical claims. Many homesteaders find these methods valuable because they combine multiple factors working together. The fat barrier was important. So was the storage space. So was the care taken during preparation. Remove enough of those pieces and the outcome changes. The old-timers understood this instinctively because they lived with the consequences of mistakes. I once spoke with a man who collected old farm journals and household records. He told me something I have never forgotten. He said many people today study old methods looking for a shortcut, while the people who originally used those methods were practicing discipline. That observation struck me as true. Traditional preservation was not about avoiding effort. It was about directing effort wisely. A few careful hours during processing season could provide months of security later. The reward was not merely food, the reward was peace of mind. Knowing that one storm, one outage, or one unexpected expense would not immediately threaten the household pantry. That peace of mind carries a value modern advertising rarely talks about. Most marketing focuses on speed, faster meals, faster delivery, faster solutions. Yet many families today feel less secure despite having more technology than previous generations could imagine. The old preservation mindset worked from a different principle. Slow preparation created future stability. The work happened up front. The benefit arrived later. In a world built around instant convenience, that way of thinking can feel almost foreign. Yet it is exactly why these practices continue attracting attention from people searching for greater independence in uncertain times. Still, one mystery remains unresolved. Understanding the role of rendered fat explains the broad idea, but it does not explain the actual process. How was the meat prepared? Why did cooked meat matter? What mistakes could ruin the result? And perhaps most importantly, why do experienced practitioners place so much emphasis on careful handling long before the fat ever touches the container? The answer lies in the details, because with traditional preservation, the smallest details often determine whether a method becomes a trusted ally or a disappointing lesson learned the hard way. The old practitioners who relied on fat-based preservation usually started long before any container was filled. The process began with the meat itself. Freshness mattered, cleanliness mattered, care mattered. Many traditional methods called for meat to be thoroughly cooked before storage, not left raw. That detail often surprises people. Cooking reduced moisture, changed texture, and prepared the meat for the next stage. Then came the rendered fat, not cloudy, not full of scraps. Properly prepared. The goal was to create a clean, protective layer. Different families had different habits, but the principle stayed remarkably consistent. Attention at the beginning prevented trouble later. The work nobody saw often mattered most. That truth reaches far beyond food preservation. Think about a fence line. Most people notice the boards after the fence stands finished. Few notice the measuring, digging, and leveling that happened beforehand. Preservation worked much the same way. The visible result sat quietly on a shelf. The invisible effort happened days earlier. Many old households accepted that reality because they viewed preparations differently than we often do today. They did not expect convenience to solve every problem. They expected effort to create future freedom. A few hours invested at the right moment could reduce worry for months. That was the bargain they willingly made. If you listen carefully to older homesteaders, another theme appears. They rarely speak about self-reliance as isolation. They speak about it as breathing room. A stocked pantry provides options. A preserved food supply provides flexibility. The goal is not proving superiority over anyone else. The goal is avoiding unnecessary vulnerability. When storms arrive, when prices jump, when unexpected hardships appear, options matter. That is why many people become interested in older food skills in the first place. Not because they reject modern life, because they understand that relying entirely on one system creates risks. Practical knowledge becomes another layer of protection, much like a spare tire carried in a truck. Of course, there is an honest limit that deserves repeating. No preservation method should be treated casually. Conditions vary. Storage spaces vary. Preparation quality varies. Tradition can offer useful lessons, but tradition is not a substitute for good judgment. Anyone exploring historical food preservation should research carefully, follow reliable food safety guidance, and understand that results depend heavily on proper execution. The old-timers knew this better than anyone. They respected their methods precisely because they understood their limits. Confidence came from experience, not blind faith. That balance between trust and caution is one of the most valuable lessons they left behind. What fascinates me is how quickly forgotten skills can return once curiosity takes hold. A person begins by learning about traditional meat preservation. Soon they become interested in canning, then root cellars, then gardening, then seed saving. One practical skill often leads naturally to another. The pattern repeats because these abilities share a common foundation. They teach people how to depend more on their own preparation and less on constant outside support. Not completely, not absolutely, just enough to create a little breathing room. In uncertain times, that breathing room feels increasingly valuable to many households across the country, and perhaps that explains why stories like Eli's stay with us. The lesson was never really about a jar of meat sitting on a shelf. The lesson was about calm. While others worried about a powerless freezer, he sat comfortably on his porch listening to rain strike the roof. That confidence did not come from luck, it came from preparation. He had spent years building habits that reduced dependence on any single piece of equipment. If one solution failed, another remained. The preserved food in his pantry represented something larger than storage. It represented resilience quietly accumulated over time through ordinary choices. There is a reason many older people speak fondly about lessons learned from parents, grandparents, and neighbors. Those lessons carried more than instructions, they carried a worldview. Waste less, learn useful things, prepare before you need to, respect what works, question whether convenience is always an improvement. Not every old idea deserves revival. Some disappeared for good reasons, but others still hold value. The challenge is learning to tell the difference. That requires curiosity, humility, and a willingness to look beyond whatever happens to be popular at the moment. Practical wisdom often survives in places fashionable opinion rarely bothers to visit. Before we part ways, I would genuinely like to hear your experience. Was there a food preservation habit, pantry tradition, or household skill that your parents, grandparents, or an older neighbor practiced that seems uncommon today? Those memories matter more than people realize. They preserve knowledge every bit as much as jars preserve food, and if conversations like this feel worthwhile to you, stay close to this community. There are still plenty of forgotten skills worth dusting off. Next time, we'll step through an old root cellar door in the middle of winter and see why some vegetables remained crisp long after snow covered the fields. Above,